Welcome everyone to the Nunkie Arms. Now, I just need to be reassured, first of all, that you can hear me because I've come on holiday without my microphone. So if the first person up there can just tell me that I am audible. Good, excellent. There we are. Splendid. Welcome to the Nunkie Arms holiday version. I noticed from the comments that some of you are on holiday. Someone was in Anglesey, a great holiday destination. I'm on the North Yorkshire coast. I'm just a couple of miles north of Whitby. And yeah, this week the weather's been all right, but today is an autumnal day. And as I drove to the spa to buy my supplies for tonight, I heard the autumn coming down and the road calling to me. And it reminded me that this weekend, one of my things on the to-do list is to update my website with all the dates that I have coming up in October, November, and December, which I will do. So next week, look on the Nunkie website. You'll probably get a newsletter which will tell you all the night times that are coming up. So yeah, I've been here. I've just spent there was a kind of family get together a couple of weeks ago, and then I've spent the last week here on my own working on the sequel to the Ghosts of the Chit Chat book, a long overdue thing, which I hope will come out from Swan River Press sometime next year, I hope. Next Saturday, online, you can register for The Signal Man. I've done it before, done it more than once before, but it's such a good story. I like to do it every so often, and I'll be doing a live stream of that next Saturday, but it's one of the ones that you have to register for rather than just tune into. Details on Facebook or Twitter, or wherever you follow this. Also, another thing I've been doing this summer is printing with great frustration because my machine went kaput but I'm getting a new one delivered next week. DVDs of the new Nunkie DVD, which is called The Witches of M.R. James, and it's a performance of the ash tree, along with reading of the Fenstanton Witch, and a documentary about the ash tree, and a very interesting interview with a great scholar of witchcraft, Malcolm Gaskill. So there's some good extras on it, and it's it's a well-filmed performance with one, I think, flaw that you'll notice in it, which I don't think will spoil your enjoyment. Anyway, now Anna Portillo says that many scary stories have been inspired by that coast. Well, I mean, Whitby. I mean, there's an obvious one, Dracula. My favourite Whitby story is not Dracula. It's Arthur Macken's The Happy Children, which I've done. You can find on the YouTube channel somewhere. But yeah, what else? What other great stories of the North Yorkshire coast are there? There's lots of folklore. But yeah, if you have any stories of North York coast to recommend, then please put them there. Dunfermline. Good, I can be heard. All right, so the theme, it was exactly a year ago tomorrow that I was in Portland, Providence, Rhode Island. I was attending Necronomicon, which is the H.P. Lovecraft jamboree, and I was doing a performance there. But I did a live Nunkie Arms from my hotel room. Anyone there? Anyone attend that? I think I did. I did stories from Weird Tales magazine. Anyway, this is another kind of Nunkie outside broadcast. As I say, North Yorkshire, and we're going to do stories about people about holidays. Now, it's amazing how many ghost stories, particularly M.R. James ones, but also, I mean, many of them involve men, and it is usually men, on holiday on their own. And I suppose when they're on their own, they're more vulnerable to overthinking things and to unfamiliar surroundings and so on. And also, the first one anyway is about a man convalescing. And again, there's a lot of ghost stories about convalescence. The Terror of the Blue John Gap is one that I've done recently, which is a story by Arthur Conan Doyle. But anyway, even though men often are the protagonist, and they are in this one, this first story is written by one of the most celebrated female writers of weird tales from the genre and roughly the period of M.R. James, Eleanor Scott. I'll read you. This is the one of the excellent British Library books of weird tales. Randall's Round, which is a story that I've read on YouTube before. You can find it. Eleanor Scott was a pseudonym used by Helen Magdalene Lees, an Oxford-based teacher and author of a handful of novels and short stories. She lived from 1892 to 1965, and she was obviously the marrow of M.R. James. Now, the stories in her original book of Randall's Round, which is a collection of ghost stories, of which Randall's Round is the title story, she says that they were, let me just find it, I think she says that they were all inspired by dreams. They've all had their origin in dreams, she said. But from the story that I'm about to read you, it's obvious that before she fell asleep that night, she was reading a particular author with which we are all familiar. And this story is called Celui La. Now, I don't for a moment expect you to take my advice, said Dr. Foster, looking shrewdly at his patient. But I'm going to give it you all the same, and it's this. Pack a bag with a few things and go off tomorrow to some tiny seaside or mountain place, preferably out of England, so that you won't meet a soul that you know. Live there absolutely quietly for 3 or 4 weeks. take a reasonable amount of exercise, and then write and tell me that you're all right again. Okay? Yeah, well, that's easier said than done, growled Maddox. There aren't any quiet places left that I know of, and if there were, there wouldn't be any digs to be had on at short notice. Foster thought, all right then, I've got the very thing. There's a little place on the Breton coast, fishing village, very small, very scattered, with a long stretch of beach, heath, and moor inland, quiet as can be. Now, I happen to know the curé there pretty well, and he's an extremely decent, homely little chap. Vetier is his name. He'll take you in. I'll write to him tonight. Well, after that, Maddox couldn't in any decency really hold out. Old Foster had been really very good to him over the whole thing. Besides, it was nearly as much bother to fight him as it was to go. And in less than a week, Maddox was on his way to Kerouac in Brittany. Foster saw him off with some relief. He knew Maddox well and knew that he was suffering from years of overwork and worry. He understood how very repugnant effort of any kind was to him, or he thought he did. But in reality, really no one can quite understand the state of exasperation or depression that illness can produce in someone else. And yet, as the absurd little train that Maddox took at Lamballe puffed serenely along between tiny rough orchards, the overwrought passenger, he began to feel soothed. And then as the line turned north and west and the cool wind came in from across the dim stretches of moorland, he grew content and almost serene. Dusk had fallen when he got out at the shed that marked the station of Kerouac. The curé, a short, plump man in soutane and broad-brimmed hat, met him with the kind, almost effusive greeting that Breton peasants give to every guest, and conducted the stumbling steps of a visitor to a rough country lane, falling steeply downhill between two high, dark banks that smelt of gorse and heather and damp earth. Maddox could just see the level line of sea lying before him, framed by the steep banks of moor on either hand. Above, a few pale stars glimmered in the dim sky, and he reflected that it was all really very peaceful. Now, Maddox fell into the simple life of the Kerouac Presbytery at once. The curé was, as Foster had said, a very homely, friendly little man, always serene and nearly always busy because he had a large and scattered flock and took a real interest in the affairs of each member of it. Also, Maddox gathered, money was none too plentiful because the curé did all the work of the church himself, even down to the trimming of the grass and shrubs that surrounded the little windswept building. And the country around appealed very strongly to the visitor. It was at once desolate and friendly, rough and peaceful. He particularly liked the long reaches of the shore, where the tangle of heath and whin gave places to tufts of coarse, whitish grass, and then to a belt of shingle and the long, level stretches of smooth sand. He liked to walk there when evening had fallen, the moorland on his left rising black to the grey sky, the sea, smooth and calm, stretching out infinitely on his right, a shining ripple lifting here and there. Oddly enough, Monsieur le Curé did not seem to approve of these evening rambles, but that, Maddox told himself, was common among peasants of all races, and he idly wondered whether this were due to a natural liking for the fireside after a day in the open, or whether there were in some ancient fear of spirits and demons that country people used to fear in the dim time entre le chien et le loup. Anyhow, he wasn't going to give up his evening strolls for a superstition of someone else's. It was near the end of October, but it was very calm weather for the time of year. And one evening, the air was so mild and the faint shine of the stars so lovely that Maddox extended his walk beyond his usual limits. He'd always had the beach to himself at that time of the evening, and he felt a quite natural, if unjustifiable, annoyance when he first noticed that there was somebody else with him on the shore that night. The figure was perhaps 50 yards away. At first he thought it was a peasant woman, because it had some kind of hood drawn over the head, and the arms, which it was waving or wringing, were covered by long hanging sleeves. And then as he drew nearer, he saw that it was much too tall to be a woman. and he jumped to the conclusion that it might be a monk or a wandering friar of exceptional height. The light was very dim because the new moon had set, and the stars showed a faint diffused light among the thin drifts of cloud. But even so, Maddox couldn't help noticing that the person before him was behaving very oddly. He couldn't determine its sex, moved at an incredible speed up and down a short stretch of the beach, waving its draped arms. And then suddenly, to his horror, it broke out into a hideous cry, like the howl of a dog. There was something in that cry that turned Maddox cold. Again, it rose, and again it was an eerie, wailing, hooting sound, dying away over the empty moor. And then the creature dropped on its knees and began scratching at the earth with its hands. A memory forgotten until now flashed into Maddox's mind, a memory of that rather horrible story in Hans Andersen about Anne Lisbeth and the drowned child. The thin cloud obscured the faint light for a moment, and when Maddox looked again, the figure was still crouching on the shore, scrabbling with its fingers in the loose sand. And this time it gave Maddox the impression of something else. It was a horrible impression of an enormous toad. He hesitated, and then, swallowing down his reluctance with an effort, he walked towards the crouching, shrouded creature. As he approached it, it sprang suddenly upright, and with a curious gliding movement, impossible to describe, sped away inland at an incredible speed, its gown flapping as it went. Again, Maddox heard the long-drawn, mournful howl. He stood gazing through the thickening dusk. It's impossible to tell in this light, of course, he said, but it looked very, very tall. And what an odd look it had of being flat. It looked like a scarecrow with no thickness. He wondered at his own relief that the creature had gone. He told himself that it was because he loathed any abnormality, and there could be no doubt that the person he had seen, whether it was monk or woman, was crazed and not actually insane. He walked to the place where it had crouched. There was a patch of disturbed sand, rough among the surrounding smoothness. It occurred to him to look for the footprints made by the flying figure to see if they bore out his impression of abnormal height. But either the light was too bad for him to find them, or the creature had simply leapt straight onto the belt of shingle. At any rate, there were no footmarks visible. Maddox now knelt down beside the patch of disturbed sand and, half idly and half in interest, began to sift it through with his fingers, and then he felt something hard and smooth. It's probably just a stone, but he picked it up. But it wasn't a stone. Anyway, though the loose, damp sand clung to it so that he could not clearly distinguish what it was, he got to his feet, cleaning it with his handkerchief, and he saw that it was a box or a case of some kind, 3 or 4 inches long, covered with some kind of rude carving. It fell open of itself as he turned it about, and he saw that inside was a wrapping of something like and yet unlike leather. Inside again was something that crackled like paper. Well, he looked around to see whether the figure that had either buried it or sought this object, he wasn't sure which it had done, was returning, but he could see nothing but the bushes of gorse and heath, black and stunted against the grey sky. There was no sound but the sigh of the night wind and the gentle lap of the incoming tide. And his curiosity proved too strong for him. He slipped the case into his pocket and he turned homewards. Supper, which was a simple meal of soup and cheese and cider, was awaiting him when he got in, and he had no time to do anything more than change his shoes and wash his hands. But after supper, sitting one side of the wide hearth while the curé smoked placidly on the other, Maddox felt the little box in his pocket, and he began to tell his host of his queer adventure. Now, the cure's lack of enthusiasm rather dampened him. No, he knew of no woman in the whole of his parish who would behave as Maddox had described. There was no monastery in the neighborhood, and if there were, it would not be permitted to the brethren to act like that. He seemed mildly incredulous, in fact, until Maddox, who was quite nettled by now, took out the little case and slapped it on the table. It was actually a more uncommon object than he'd first supposed. And it was, to begin with, very heavy and hard, as heavy as lead, but of a far harder metal. And the chasing on it was queer. The figures reminded Maddox of runes, and remembering the prehistoric remains in Brittany, a thrill suddenly ran through him. I mean, he was no antiquarian, but it occurred to him that this find might be an extremely interesting one. He opened the case now, and he had thought that there was a scrap of some leathery substance within. Oh, well, he was right. Carefully rolled around a piece of parchment. And of course, that couldn't possibly be prehistoric, but well, Maddox's interest was still piqued. He smoothed it out and began stumblingly to read out the crabbed words written on it. The language was Latin of a sort, and he was so occupied in endeavouring to make out the individual words that he made no attempt to construe their meaning until Father Vettier stopped him with a horrified cry and even tried to snatch the document out of his hand. Monsieur! Maddox looked up, very startled. The little priest had gone quite pale, and he looked as horrified as if he'd been asked to listen to the most shocking blasphemy. Pardon, mon père, what is wrong? Said Madsen, astonished. You should not read things like that, said the little cure. It is wrong to have that paper. It is a great sin. But why? Said Maddox. I mean, what does it mean? I wasn't translating it. Well, the little colour crept back into the priest's cheeks, but he still looked very disturbed. Monsieur, it was an invocation. It is a terrible paper, that. It calls up celui-là, that one. Maddox's eyes suddenly grew bright and eager. Really? Is it honestly? He opened the sheet again. The priest sprang to his feet. No, monsieur, I beg you. You do not understand. Well, he looked so agitated that Maddox felt some compunction. After all, the little chap, he'd been very decent to him, and if he took it like that, he couldn't help thinking that it was a great pity to let these ignorant peasants have jobs as parish priests. I mean, good grief, there was enough superstition in the church as it was without drafting old forgotten country charms and incantations into it. A little annoyed, Maddox put the paper back into its case and dropped the whole thing into his pocket. I mean, he knew perfectly well that if the cure got his hands on it, he would have no scruples whatever about destroying the whole thing. Now, that evening didn't pass as pleasantly as usual. Maddox felt irritated by the ignorance of his companion, and Father Vettier was quite unlike his customary placid self. He seemed nervous, timid even, and Maddox noted that when the presbytery cat sprang onto the back of her master's chair and rubbed her head silently against his ear, the cure almost sprang out of his chair as he hurriedly crossed himself. The time dragged until Maddox could propose retiring to bed, and long after he'd been in his room, he could hear Father Vettier whispering prayers and clacking the beads of his rosary. Well, when morning came, Maddox felt rather ashamed of himself for having alarmed the little priest quite so much last night, as he undoubtedly had done. His compunction increased when he saw Father Vettier as he came in from early mass, because the little man looked quite as pale and downcast as he had the evening before, and Maddox mentally cursed himself. He felt like a man who'd distressed a child, and he He cast about for some small way of making amends. Halfway through déjeuner, he had an idea. "Father," he said, you're making alterations in your church, aren't you?" The little man brightened visibly. This, Maddox knew, was his pet hobby. "Oh, oui, monsieur. For some time I've been at work, and now at last I have enough. Monsignor has given me his blessing. It is, you see, that there is beside our church here, there is a fragment of an older building. Oh, oh, it is such an old building. One says perhaps that it was maybe also a church or a shrine perhaps once. Well, nobody really knows. But it's very well built. Yeah, it's very strong. And I conceived the idea that I might join this building to my church. Yeah? I mean, figure for yourself, monsieur, then I would have a double aisle. Huh? That would be magnifique. I shall paint it naturally so as to make it all as it should look. The church is already painted of a blue of the most heavenly color for the Holy Virgin, with lilies in white. And I had hoped for lilies of gold, but gold paint, oh, c'est incroyable, so expensive. And the new chapel, you see, I will paint in crimson for the Sacred Heart, Le Sacré-Cœur, with hearts of yellow as a border. That will be very gay, will it not? Yes, oh, very gay, added Maddox gloomily. I mean, there was something that he liked about the shabby whitewashed little church, and he felt pained at the thought of Father Vetier's blue and crimson and yellow. But the little curé noticed nothing. No. Already I've begun the present church, and monsieur, you should see it. It is celestial. Oui, the couleur. Now, I shall begin to prepare the old building so that as soon as the walls are built to join it to the present church, I can decorate it. Yeah, they will not take long, the little walls, not long at all. And then I shall paint. He seemed lost in a vision of rapture. Maddox was both amused and rather touched. Good little chap, he thought. It had been a shame to annoy him the night before with that silly incantation business, and he felt a renewed impulse to please the friendly little man. "Well, listen, Father, can I help you, perhaps? I don't know, maybe I could scrape the walls for you or something like that. I'm not going to offer to paint. I don't have any expertise there." And the priest positively beamed. I mean, he was a genial soul who loved company, even at his work. But even more so, he loved putting on the thick layers of bright colours according to his long-planned design. To have a companion who didn't want to paint was more than he could ever hope for, and he accepted with delight. Well, after breakfast, Maddox was taken to see the proposed addition to the church. It stood on the north side of the little church, which of course ran east-west, and as far as Maddox could see, consisted mainly of a piece of masonry running parallel with the wall. Fragments of walls now crumbled almost joined it to the east and west ends of the church, and it might have been at one time part of a little place of worship. Certainly, as Father Vetti had said, it wouldn't take much alteration to connect it to the present church as a north aisle. And Maddox set to work to chip the plaster facing from the old wall with a will. In the afternoon, the curé announced that he had to pay a visit to a sick man some miles away. He accepted with great gratitude Maddox's proposal that he should continue the preparations for the painting of the new aisle. And with such efficient help, he said, he would have the additions of the church ready for the great feast of Saint Michel, patron saint both of the village and the church. Well, Maddox was delighted to see how completely his plan had worked in restoring the little man's placid good humour. Shortly after 2, he went into the churchyard and resumed his labours. He chipped away industriously and was just beginning to find the work rather boring when he made a discovery that set him chipping again eagerly at the coat of plaster which later hands had daubed thickly on the original wall. There were mural paintings here. It was obvious. And soon he'd laid bare quite a large stretch, and he could see that the decoration formed a band, 6 or 7 feet deep, about 2 feet from the ground, nearly the whole length of the wall. The light was fading, the colours were dim, but Maddox could see enough to interest him really very, very much. The paintings seemed to represent a stretch of the seashore, and although the landscape was treating conventionally, he thought that it looked like a part of the beach near Kerouac. There were figures in the painting too, he could see, and these now aroused his excitement, because at least one of them was familiar to him. A tall shape, hooded, with hanging draperies. That was a figure that he'd seen the night before on the beach. I mean, perhaps it was due to some archaic treatment of the picture that this figure gave the same impression of flatness. And the other figure, I mean, if it was a figure at all, was even stranger still. It crouched on the ground before the hooded shape, and to Maddox it suggested, I don't know, some rather disgusting animal. A toad, perhaps, or a thick, squat fish. But the odd thing was that it squatted before the tall figure, and even though it was on the ground, it gave the impression of domination. Maddox felt strangely thrilled. He peered closely at the painting, endeavouring to make out clearly what it represented. But the short October noon was drawing in fast, and beyond his first impression, he could gather very little. He noticed that there was one unexpected figure in the otherwise half-familiar landscape, a hillock or a pile of large stones or rocks, on one side of which he could just make out an inscription, or at least fragments of words. Qui peut venir, he read in one place. And lower down, celui qui écoutera et qui viendra, sacré. It was all very unclear. There was also some other vague object, a pile of seaweed, Maddox thought, lying heaped below the hillock. Now, little though he knew either of art or archaeology, Maddox was rather excited by this discovery. He felt sure that this queer painting must represent some local legend or superstition, and it was very odd that he should have seen, or at least thought he should have seen, the figure on the beach before he discovered in the mural painting. I mean, there could be no doubt that he had seen it, and that it was no mere fancy of his tired mind, that there was the box and the incantation or whatever it was in his pocket to prove. And then that gave him an idea. It would be extremely interesting if he should find that the old French words on the mural painting and the Latin words on the parchment in any way corresponded. So he took out the little case from his pocket and he opened it. Clamabo et exaudiat me, I will call and he will hear. I mean, that could refer to any prayer. Sounds quite like a psalm, in fact. Quoniam iste qui venere potest, qui venere potest, qui per venir, who can come. And what's this? Sacrificium hominum? Heavens above! That can't mean. And then far across the beach, he heard a faint cry, the distant howling of the thing that he'd seen on the beach. He listened intently, and he could hear nothing more. Oh, it's just some dog howling, he said to himself. I'm getting jumpy. Now, where was I? And he turned back to the manuscript. But even during the few moments of distraction, the light had faded further, and he really had to strain his eyes now to see anything of the words. E paludinis ubi est habitaculum tuum ego te convoco, he read aloud, spelling out the worn writing. I don't think there's anything in the painting to correspond with that. From the marshes where thy dwelling is, I call thee. What was that? What does it mean from the marshes? E paludinis ubi est habitaculum tuum ego te convoco. And he broke off again because there again was that dreadful howl. And it was not the howl of a dog. And it was really very close. Well, Maddox did not stop to think. He leapt up, ran through the yard into the presbytery, and locked the door behind him. And he bolted every window in the tiny house. And then, and not until then, did he pause to wonder at his own precipitate flight. He was trembling violently, his breath coming in painful gasps. I mean, he told himself he'd acted like a schoolgirl, and yet he could not bring himself to open a window. He went into the little sitting room and made up the fire to an unwonted size, and then he tried to take an interest in Father Vetier's library of devotional books until the little curé himself should return. He was very nervous and very uneasy. God, I mean, it seemed to him that even now he could hear some creature. He told himself it must be a large dog or a goat, perhaps, snuffling about the walls and under the door. He was inexpressibly relieved when at last he heard the short, decided step of the curé coming up the path to the house. Well, Maddox was very restless that night. He had short, heavy snatches of sleep in which he was haunted by dreams of pursuit by that flat, hooded being. And once he woke with a strangled cry and a cold shudder of disgust from a dream that in his flight he'd stumbled and fallen face forward onto something soft and cold that moved beneath. Oh God, it was a mass of toads. He lay awake for a long time after that dream, but eventually dropped off again into a drowsy state, half waking and half sleeping, in which he had an uncomfortable impression that he wasn't alone in the room. Somebody was breathing close to him, moving about in a fumbling, stealthy way, and his nerves were so overwrought that he simply had not the courage to put out a hand and feel for the matches, lest his fingers should close upon. No. He did not try to imagine what they might close upon. Towards dawn, he fell into an uneasy doze and awoke with a start. Some sound had wakened him. A melancholy howling cry rang in his ears, but whether it had actually sounded or whether it was merely part of his memories and evil dreams, he couldn't tell. Nevertheless, he looked ill and worn at breakfast, and he gave his bad night as an excuse for failing to continue with his work on the old church wall, and he spent a wretched moping day. He could settle to do nothing indoors. At last, tempted by the mellow October sun, he decided he'd just go out for a brisk, short walk. He'd return before dusk, and he would avoid the lonely reaches of the shore. And as it turned out, the afternoon was really quite delicious. The rich scent of the gorse and the heather, warm in the sun, and the cool touch from the sea that just freshened the breeze, cooled and calmed Maddox wonderfully. He'd almost forgotten about his terrors from the night before. At least he was able to push them into the back corner of his mind. And he turned homeward contentedly. Even in his new calm, he decided he was not there to stay out after sundown, when his eyes happened to fall on the white road where the declining sun threw his shadow long and thin before him. As he saw his shadow, his heart gave a heavy thud, because a second shadow walked beside his own. He spun round. No mortal creature was in sight. The road stretched empty behind him, and on either side the moorland spread his breast to the wide sky. And yet he ran to the presbytery like a hunted thing. That evening, Father Vetier ventured to speak to him. Monsieur, I do not wish to intrude myself into your affairs, but I have promised my good friend, Monsieur Foster, that I will take care of you. Now, you are not a Catholic, I understand that, but I must ask you, will you please wear this? And as he spoke, he took from his own neck a thin silver chain to which was attached a little medal, black with age, and he held it out to his guest. "Thank you, father," said Maddox, and he slipped the chain around his neck. "No, thank you, monsieur. And now I must venture to ask you, will you let me change your room? I have one. It is not as good as yours, I admit, but it has a small opening into the church. You will perhaps repose there better. Please allow this, Monsieur Maddox." "With very great pleasure," said Maddox. You're very kind to me, father." And the little man patted his hand. I like you very much, monsieur. And yeah, I am not a foolish man. We Bretons, we see much that we do not look at, and we hear much to which we do not listen. "Oh, father," said Maddox awkwardly. "Look, can I ask you something? When I read out that paper, you remember well, you said that it was an invocation, that it summoned celui-là. So, did you mean the devil?" "Oh, no. No, my son. I cannot tell you. It has no name. In Kerouac, we say simply celui-là. That there. And you will not, if you please, speak of it again, monsieur. It is not good to speak of celui-là." "I can imagine it isn't," said Maddox, and the conversation dropped. Well, he certainly slept better that night. In the morning, he told himself that might in fact be for more than one reason, because the bed might be more comfortable, but in fact he knew that wasn't the case. Or he might have overtired himself the day before, or in fact the little cure's offerings might somehow give him a kind of impression of safety and protection without really having the least power to guard him. Anyway, his feeling of security increased when the priest announced, "Monsieur, tomorrow we will have another guest. Yeah, Monsieur Foster has done me the honor to accept my invitation for a visit." "What? Dr. Foster? Really? Well, that's excellent," said Maddox. And he felt that the doctor, he stood for science and civilization and sanity and all the comforting, reassuring things of life that were so utterly lacking in the desolate wilderness of Kerouac. And sure enough, Foster came the next day, and he was just as solid and ugly and completely reassuring as Maddox had hoped that he would be, and half feared that he would not be. He seemed to ignore his friend's physical condition at first, but on the day after his arrival, he got down to business. "Maddox, now, I don't know how you ever expect to get fit again. No, I mean, you come here for the air as much as anything. I said that you had to take moderate exercise, and yet here you are moping about this poky little house." And needless to say, Father Vettier was not present when this conversation took place. "I mean, come on, what is wrong with the countryside? I'd have said it was excellent walking country." Well, Maddox flushed a little. I suppose it's a bit boring walking alone," he said, although boring was not really the correct word. "All right, maybe so, but you can get out a bit more, at least if I'm here with you, can't I? You can, I don't know, take me out this afternoon. The cure's gone off for some kind of conference." Maddox wondered uneasily how much Foster knew. I mean, had he in fact come off his own bat, or had Father Vettier been worried about his guest and sent for him? If that were the case, what exactly had the priest told him? He thought that he'd soon get that out of Foster. Anyway, they walked along the beach, farther than Maddox had ever yet been. He'd avoided the shore of late, and he'd not felt up to going so far when he first came to Kerouac. And yet, although he knew that he'd never been on that particular reach of shore, the place seemed strangely familiar to him. I mean, it's common, I suppose, to feel that one knows a place which one is now seeing for the first time, but the expression was so vivid that Maddox couldn't help remarking upon it to his companion. "Oh, now, come on, don't talk rot," said Dr. Foster. "Now, you haven't been in Brittany before. You told me that, and you say that you've never been as far as this along the shore. It's not such uncommon country, you know, Maddox. It's like a lot of other places, really." "Oh, I know," said Maddox, but he wasn't fully satisfied. He was poor company for the rest of the walk, and was very silent on the way home. No amount of chaff from Foster could rouse him, and at last the doctor abandoned the effort, and the men reached the presbytery in rather awkward silence. The next day was close, threatening rain, although the downpour held off from hour to hour. Neither of the two Englishmen felt inclined to walk under that lowering sky. Father Vettier, however, had a second urgent summons from his sick patient at Cap Morel, and he set off, wrapped in the curious garment of tarpaulin, soon after the second déjeuner. He remarked that he might take the occasion of being so near to Préneuf to pay some visits there, and that he probably would not be in until nightfall. "If Monsieur should feel disposed, Monsieur Foster might be interested to see the alterations I have planned for the church. I know Monsieur Foster is a man of taste. He might be interested." He was so clearly keen to display his decorations, and yet a little afraid of appearing vain if he showed them himself, that Maddox smiled. "Oh, of course, Father. I'm sure he'd be delighted to see them." And yet, although he could give no possible reason for it, he felt disinclined to go near that half-ruined wall with its stretch of painting. I mean, he knew that it was absurd. He'd worked there until he was tired, and he'd been startled by the howling of a dog. That was all it was. No doubt, when he came to look at it again, he would find that the fresco was just a clumsy daub, and that his own overwrought nerves, together with the uncanny light of the gloaming and the horrible barking dog, had exaggerated into something sinister and horrible. He declared to himself that if he had the courage to go and look again, he'd simply laugh at it and at any of his reactions to it. But at the back of his mind, he knew that he would never have dared go there alone. And it was a mixture of bravado and a kind of hope that Foster's hoarse sense would lay his terror for him that finally induced him to propose a visit to the place. Foster was mildly interested by what Maddox had told him of the painting on the ruined wall, and he went out first to see the rough little churchyard. Maddox, half reluctantly, went to fetch down the little case that he picked up on the beach in order that Foster might with his own eyes compare the two inscriptions. And when he did go out to join his friend, he could hardly bring himself to go over to the wall that he'd been working on. It took quite an effort to force his feet over to it. And yet, the decoration was not quite as he'd remembered it. I mean, the figures were so indistinct and faint that they were hardly visible now. In fact, Maddox could well believe that a stranger would not recognize the daub as representing figures at all. His relief at this discovery was quite absurd. He felt as if an immense and crushing weight had now been lifted from his spirit, and his first anxiety over, he bent to examine the rest of the painting more attentively than he had done before. Yeah, I mean, that was exactly as he'd remembered it. The pile of stones with the half illegible words, the tumbled huddle of seaweeds or rags lying before it, the long reach of shore. Hey, that was it! Foster! Foster, come here! Come and look, he said. Where? Said the doctor, coming over. Look! This fresco, or whatever it is, I said that bit of shore that we were walking on yesterday was familiar. This is where I saw it. Said Foster. Oh, no, yeah, it could be. I'm all very much alike, though, this part of the beach. I don't see anything to get worked up about. Oh, God. Well, if you're going to take that line, I mean, you doctors are all alike, really, aren't you? Keep calm. Don't get excited. Oh, nothing to worry about here. He broke off, gulping with rage. Hey, Maddox, come on. Look, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to snub you. I just thought. Look, just tell me what you've got on your mind, will you? Tell me, Maddox. There's a good chap. What is it? But Maddox had dried up. He couldn't explain. He knew that his solid, comfortable friend could never understand that his terror was not imaginary. He could not bear to watch him soothing down his friend, to see the thought hysteria developing in his mind. And yet, oh gosh, what a relief it would be to tell. Look at this, he said at last. And he took from his pocket the case that he found on the beach. Now, Foster, what can you tell me about that paper? Well, Foster moved out of the shadow of the wall so that the pale, watery sunlight struggling through the clouds fell onto the parchment. Maddox, a little relieved by the serious way that he took it, turned back to examine the painting again. They were certainly very odd that the figures, which he remembered so clearly and which had seemed so very distinct, should now appear so dim that he doubted their reality even. They seemed fainter now than when they'd been seen a few minutes ago. And that heap flung beneath the hillock, I mean, whatever did that represent? He began to whether that wasn't in fact a drowned man. He bent closer, and as he stooped, he was aware that someone beside him was looking over his shoulder, almost leaning on him. It's odd, isn't it, Foster? He said. What do you make of that thing there, huddled under the stones? Well, there was no answer, and Maddox turned. And then he sprang to his feet with a shuddering cry that died in his throat, because the thing leaning over his shoulder was not his friend. It was the hooded creature from the beach. Now, Foster had found the parchment so interesting that he was anxious to see it more clearly. He peered at it closely for a minute and then decided to go into the presbytery for a light. He had some difficulty with the old-fashioned oil lamp, but when he finally got it burning, he thought that the document fully repaid his trouble. He became so absorbed in it that it was not for some minutes that he realized it was growing dark and that Maddox had not yet rejoined him. He felt quite disproportionately anxious as he hurried out into the tiny overgrown churchyard. He was startled into something very like panic when he found that nobody was there. Without reason, he knew that there was something horribly wrong now, and blindly obeying the same instinct, he rushed out of the tiny enclosure and ran at his top speed down to the beach. I mean, he knew that he would find whatever there was to find on that lonely reach that was pictured on the old wall. There was a faint glimmer of daylight still, enough to confuse the light until Foster, half distraught with a nameless fear, could hardly tell substance from shadow. But once he thought he saw ahead of him two figures, one a man's and the other a tall, wavering shape, almost indistinguishable in the gloom. The sand dragged at his feet till they felt like lead. He struggled on, his breath coming now in gasps that tore at his lungs. And then at last the sand gave way to coarse grass, and then to a stretch of salt marshland where the mud oozed up over his shoes and water came lapping about his ankles. Open pools lay here and there, and he saw, as he struggled and tore his feet from the viscous slime, horrible creatures like toads or thick, squat fish moving heavily in the watery ooze. The light had almost gone. As he reached the line of beach, he knew, and for one terrible moment he thought that he was too late. There was a pile of stones, and beneath them now lay a huddled black mass, Something, was it a shadow, wavered, something tall and vague above the heap, and before it squatted a shape that turned Foster cold, something thick and lumpish, like an enormous toad. He screamed as he dragged his feet from the loathsome mud that clooped and gulped under him. He screamed aloud for help, and then suddenly he heard a voice, a human voice. In nomine Deo omnipotenti, it cried. Foster made one stupendous effort and fell forward on his knees. The blood sang in his ears, but through the hammering of his pulses, he heard the sound like the howling of a dog dying away in the distance. It was by the providence of God that I was there, said Father Vettier afterwards. I do not often come by the shore. We men of Kerouac, monsieur, we do not like to visit the shore after it is dusk. But it was late and the road by the shore is quicker. Indeed, I think that it was the good saints that led me. But if my fear had been stronger, so that I had not gone that way, and it was very strong, monsieur, my fear was very strong. But then I do not think that your friend would be alive now. Nor do I, said Foster soberly. My God, Father. Sacrificium hominum. Surely not. And I saw that loathsome thing waiting. I mean, he was lying in front of that hellish altar or whatever it was. But why, Father? How did I have power over him? I think, monsieur, it was because he read the invocation out loud. He called it, you see, monsieur. He summoned it with the words. When he saw it first, is often unseen. Now we are used to it, we men of Kerouac. We call it celui-là. But you see, celui-là is, I believe, only a servant of the other. Well, said Foster soberly, you're a braver man than me, Padre. I wouldn't spend a single minute here if I could help it. And as soon as poor Maddox can travel, I'm going to go back home with him. As to living here, said Father Vettier. Yes, monsieur, you are right to go. But for me, oh, no. This is my post, you see. And one prays, monsieur, always. One prays. Yeah, a bit of a long one. Oh, sorry. I'm just yeah. Yeah. Oof. So yeah, that was quite long. We're gonna have a break. I need the loo. And then we'll have another shorter story afterwards. Okay, so we're just gonna have a little. We're gonna have a little comfort break. Okay. And the loo is through here. To the Sea by Philip Larkin. To step over the low wall that divides road from concrete walk above the shore brings sharply back something known long before, the miniature gaiety of seasides. Everything crowds under the low horizon, steep beach, blue water, towels, red bathing caps. The small hushed waves repeated fresh collapse upon the warm yellow sand, and further off, a white steamer stuck in the afternoon. Still going on. All of it. Still going on. To lie, eat, sleep in the hearing of the surf, ears to transistors that sound tame enough under the sky, or gently up and down, lead the uncertain children, frilled in white and grasping at enormous air, or wheel the rigid old along for them to feel a final summer plainly still occurs as half an annual pleasure, half a right, as when, happy at being on my own, I search the sand for famous cricketers, or farther back, my parents, listeners to the same seaside quack, first became known. Strange to it now, I watch the cloudless scene, the same clear water over smooth pebbles, the distant bathers' weak protesting trebles, down at its edge, and then the cheap cigars, the chocolate papers, tea leaves, and between the rocks, the rusting soup tins, till the first few families starts the trek back to the cars. The white steamer has gone, like breathed on glass. The sunlight has turned milky. If the worst of flawless weather is our falling short, it may be that through habit these do best, coming to the water, clumsily undressed yearly, teaching their children by a sort of clowning, helping the old too, as they ought. Just going to get a drink. Yeah, no, there we are. Okay. Yeah, exactly. You know, it's highly thought of, that story. It's not. It's very cliche. Anyway, you know, it's a. It doesn't. Yeah. So yes, that one that Ellen Cellular, it's one that people say, oh, it's so wonderful. Nah, it's all right, but it's a bit of a mess if you compare it to what it's obviously based upon. Anyway, this one that I'm going to do, which I have done before, I'm going to I think is well, yeah, I think it's highly original by LTC wrote. Oh, hang on. What's on there? Oh, I see. Sorry, I'm just. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. There. Well, LTC wrote. It's called The Shouting. I companioned Edward on many walking tours before I discovered that he had a positive phobia of woods. I mean, there was always some very good reason why we could never go through a wood. The obvious path, although marked on the Ordnance Survey map, might peter out, he said, or turn in the wrong direction. If it was hot, there'd be too many flies in the wood. If it was evening, it'd be too dark. Half the fun of walking was the view, and obviously you could never get a view in a wood. But at last there came a day when none of these pretexts could avail him. On the contrary, it was quite obvious to both of us from the map and from the lie of the land that to avoid going through this particular wood, which is quite a small wood, incidentally, it would involve a needless and lengthy cross-country detour, including scrambling through many hedges, just a kind of point-to-point walking that I really do not enjoy at all. On the other hand, it was perfectly clear from the stile at the edge of the wood and the path beyond that there lay a well-used right of way. And yet Edward stopped in his tracks, and knowing that there was no valid excuse left to him, he said with an unmistakable fear in his eyes, I'd rather not go through the wood, if you don't mind. Oh, come on, I said. Oh, it's only about a quarter of a mile wide, judging from the map. And if we leave the path, we're in for a hell of a scramble. But seeing that, he still hesitated. So I mounted the stile with a, all right, suit yourself. I know which way I'm going, over my shoulder. And I think that was the nearest we'd ever come to having a row in our whole time together. And what followed was really very, very odd. It cast an entirely new light upon Edward. I mean, it's funny how long you can know people and yet discover how little you know of them. Edward padded silently behind me, his eyes darting to right and left, as though that harmless Hertfordshire coppice harboured every species of savage beast, with the odd poisonous snake thrown in for good measure. But it was no laughing matter at the time, and I confess that I felt a shade uneasy in myself, because it was quite obvious that Edward was terrified almost out of his wits. Well, I was determined to get to the bottom of this unreasoning terror, and that evening, at the Scudamore Arms in Combercombe, I tackled him about it. Edward, I'm sorry that I persuaded you to walk through that spinney with me, I said. Look, honestly, if I realised that you felt so strongly about it, but he cut me short. Yes, truth is that would scare me stiff. What my mother said, I never should play with the gypsies in the wood, I quoted at him rather tactlessly. And then he gave me a curious, searching look. What made you say that? And then he went on. Anyway, this has got nothing to do with cautionary nursery jingles of that kind. No, it's due to something that happened to me. It was only 10 years ago, just before I met up with you, in fact. And then it all came out. He was staying in an isolated rented cottage in the bottom of one of those deep and narrow valleys that run down to the Atlantic coast of North Devon and Cornwall. The ridges between them end in formidable bare headlands and vertiginous cliffs that jut out to meet the challenge of Atlantic rollers. But one doesn't have to go too far inland from the coast before these lower slopes are thickly covered with dense woods and scrub oaks, their tops combed by the prevailing southwesterlies that funnel up the valleys till they resemble a smooth green fleece. Anyway, Edward said that he was lolling in a deck chair outside his cottage door and enjoying the hot sunshine of late July when he suddenly heard the patter of feet and the chatter of children approaching him down the lane. Now, this surprised him because there was no village within miles, but when he saw them, he thought that they must be the children of gypsies who'd camped nearby, because they were all olive complexioned with black hair and slow eyes. They were chattering eagerly together, as though anticipating some rare treat, but for the life of him, he couldn't distinguish a word that they said. I mean, could they be speaking Romany? Surely not, he thought. A boy who looked about 14 and appeared to be the eldest and the ringleader of the group was in front. And as they passed opposite his cottage gate, Edward got up from his chair, stopped the little party, and asked the leader where they were going. Speaking in perfect English, the boy replied, "Oh, we're going up to the woods for the shouting." The way he said this implied that Edward ought to have known the answer without having to ask. But before he could betray his ignorance by asking what he meant, the boy had broken into a trot, and the others, silent now but still radiating a tense expectancy, followed after him. Edward watched them cross the little wooden footbridge over the stream and then mount the step until they disappeared into the wood. And then he went back to his deck chair, pondering on this odd little encounter until he began to doze again. He was roused by what he described as a most unearthly racket. A shrill, eldritch piping and shrieking, rising every now and again to a frenzied pitch. So this was the shouting, he thought. I mean, it struck him as a scarcely human sound, sometimes reminding him of the squealing of slaughtered pigs, and sometimes of the strange cries he had once heard coming from a heronry. But what puzzled and disturbed him even more was that this shrill clatter seemed to have an accompanying ground bass, a kind of plain chant that was somehow far more horrible to hear. And at this point, Edward became almost emphatic than the shouting itself. I mean, there could be no one in that party of children with a voice like that, he insisted. I mean, it must be an acoustic trick, something like the sound of the sea beating on the rocks at the end of the valley, unnaturally echoed and magnified in that narrow space between the hanging woods. And that's how he rationalized the fear, knowing in his heart that such an explanation could not possibly be true. It was some time before the children came back, long enough for the sun to have left the floor of the valley, although it still shone brilliantly upon the higher slopes above. And they walked silently, 2 by 2, over the wooden footbridge and past Edward's gate with never a sideways glance to him. They might have been there, leaning over the gate, watching them. Soft-footed, they passed him by as though they were entranced, their lips slightly parted, their slow eyes staring fixedly ahead as though focused upon some remote distance. Young though they were, Edward admitted that he found this strange procession frankly awe-inspiring. He'd sat on for a while in the deepening shadow before at length curiosity simply got the better of him, and he set off towards the wood in the direction that the children had taken. He'd noticed the spot where the children had entered the wood because it was marked by a single ancient and stunted yew tree, which contrasted darkly against the green foliage of the oaks and their silvery lichen-bearded trunks and branches. And once he climbed the fence and entered the woods, he could find no path, although the way was still clear to him because the children had beaten down briars, nettles, and bracken in their passing. Taller than they, He had to walk bent double to avoid the dense interlacement of branches above. It was like walking through some low green tunnel, he said. Suddenly, however, he could stand upright because he found himself in a small round clearing in the midst of the wood. He thought it was strange that it was not visible from below, considering the steepness of the slope, which had left him out of breath. In the centre of the clearing, there was a low mound of short green turf, like an island in a pool of bracken. Edward walked on to the top of this central mound, and it was at once obvious that it was here that the shouting had taken place. I mean, children are great traditionalists, he reflected. It was doubtless some old country game or ritual handed on by one generation to another. My mother said I never should play with the gypsies in the wood. That silly jingle came to his head unbidden and refused to be banished. Evidently, they did not forbid such play in these parts, he thought, but positively encouraged it. He laughed aloud at this feeble joke, and then he started at the most remarkable echo. I mean, of course, woods were famous for this kind of thing, he thought, but then something much more remarkable and alarming happened. The laugh was repeated from a different part of the clearing. And this time it was no echo, but a sound such as he'd never made in his life. A deep, short sound, half bark, half bray, human and yet inhuman. The laugh came again almost the next instant, menacing this time, and from the opposite side of the clearing, although he'd heard no sound of movement in the wood. And at this, Edward became quite terrified. He stood rooted to the spot, peering now this way and that, now into the darkening wood in an attempt to locate the source of the dreadful sound. When the laugh came a fourth time, it happened to sound from the precise direction into which he was peering. Now, it may only have been some trick of the failing light, he admitted apologetically, but an inchoate mass of twigs and oak leaves seemed suddenly to form itself into a gigantic head. A head with an aureole of leafy twigs in place of hair, and a beard of grey lichen beneath a cruelly smiling mouth. There also appear to be two red eyes, although this may have been the effect of the setting sun shining through chinks in the leafy canopy of the wood. But on reflection, Edward thought that was not the case. It struck him now as a last desperate attempt on the part of his rational mind to explain in known terms the unknown. But the next instant, sheer panic seized him, and he blundered out of the clearing and down through the wood. Trees, nettles, bracken, and briars all seemed to conspire together to prevent his headlong flight. He nearly scamped himself on low branches. Nettles stung him. Briars whipped at his clothing and flesh, and tough bracken stalks tripped him so that more than once he fell headlong. And all the while that awful voice accompanied him, laughing and chuckling over his plight. He thought that if again he should see that face from which it came, his reason would snap. Nor could he bear much longer the sound of that voice, and in a vain attempt to drown it, he began to yell at the top of his voice the first ridiculous words that entered into his head. Mother said I never should play with the gypsies in the wood. Mother said I never should play with the gypsies in the wood, he shouted hysterically. By the time he finally flung himself over the fence at the edge of the wood, his clothes in tatters and blood streaming down his face, his eyes were lacerated on his head. But the horror had left him, and thankfully he flung himself down on the cool turf, which was now slightly damp with dew. There below him was the dim shape of his cottage beyond the stream, and he gazed at it as a traveller from the desert gazes at an oasis. And that was it, he said. Now you know why I dislike, God no, Dislike is far too weak a word. Why I hate the woods. But what about the children, I said. I mean, did you? No. He answered my question before I'd finished it with a shrug of his shoulders. There were no gypsies in the district at the time, I made sure of that. And I'm equally certain that they weren't local children either. After a pause, he went on. I asked the nice lady from Mortford who came every day on a bike to do the chores for me whether there was any legend or traditional custom connected with that particular part of the woodland. But all she would say was, I don't know, sir. Us do never go in there. So, well, your guess is as good as mine. Who or what the children were, I mean, personally, now that I've heard Edward's story, I'm inclined to think that they were the most frightening thing about the whole strange business. I think that's a good one. I've just seen a terrible joke about Edward Woodward. And let me just go back. I haven't even looked at the. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Xylophobia. Yeah. Xylophobia is the fear of the substance of wood rather than the collection of. But yeah, xylophobia. What a terrible thing that would be. Um. Sorry. Certainly all the more effective not having a neat explanation. Yeah, absolutely. But that, I absolutely. But it's true of almost every ghost story, I think. Well, is it a green man encounter? I think you're allowed to think that. Really, I love walking the woods. The being that I fear encountering the woods isn't a kind of tree-ish kind of goblin like that. The being I fear coming across is Rumpelstiltskin. I fear it, and yet I desire it very much as well. Yeah, Rumpelstiltskin. Dancing around in his hut. So who's that? It's been this. Oh, maybe it's because it's Friday. Yeah, no, sorry. I had to cancel it last week because I was just at the fag end of a dose of COVID, which I think I've shaken off now. So who's on holiday? Who's where? Or who's been where? Or who's going where? All right. It doesn't matter. Are you in Blackpool, really? Did we have any other seaside ghost stories that people had? Anglesey, yeah. No, Blackpool, yeah, well, Blackpool is, yes. Yeah, well, Aldborough's lovely. There's a new function has obviously been introduced to the chat on YouTube, because next to every comment now is a big fat love heart. I think I'm being encouraged to press in response to your comments. I take it for granted that I love them. Clone. Herrick, where is Clone? Is Clone? I think I might be going to Clone. I'm afraid Nerve Centre. I don't know about that Aikman one. Clone is Clone. I think I might be doing a show in Clone. Yeah, that sounds like it. Okay, I can't be certain, but I think I'm going to be doing a performance in the pub in Clone, because I never heard. I didn't believe when I first heard it that Clone was an actual place. Oh, that sounds good, Paul Dean. Well, it sounds rather sad, but yeah, okay. Let me just check about Clun. I think it's called. It sounds too good to be true. It's called the Sun at Clun. The Sun at Clun. But hang on. Yeah, no, I don't care about the skewers pictures. I seem to remember a couple of years ago I did it here. The same complaint was made. Deal with it. Yeah, Clun. I think it's the Sun Inn in Clun. What's this? Oh, no. Temple of the Toad. I like the sound of that. Okay. Okay, well, I'll need to check. The Sun Inn is owned by Three Times Brewery. I thought this, anyway, okay. I thought it was owned by an individual, but maybe. Anyway, plenty Wenlock Records. Thanks for joining in the convo. What's happening? So, anyone from Cambridge there? I'm going to be doing a. Oh, well, thank you. I imagine there's a lot of people who did turn up to the Nunkie Arms live in Manchester and York. So that's been the first kind of manifestation of Nunkie Arms live, and yeah, it went pretty well. I thought I personally enjoyed both evenings, both nice pubs. Yes, there you are. There we are. Dominic asking, is there any more? Yes, I think there will be, because it went quite well. In Cambridge, Oh, there we are, Nikki. So on, I think it's the 30th of August, a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be doing the same two stories as I've done in the Nunkie Arms Live. Not having a pub, unfortunately, although you can go to a pub and bring beer. It's at the Cambridge Museum of Technology, which is a really interesting place to go to. And I'm going to be doing Tales of Pan there. So, yeah. Oh, Stuart. So it's not, it may even be off our website. Hang on. I think look at the Nunkie website. I think there's a link to it there. But if not, then Google Cambridge Museum of Technology and their events, and you'll find Tales of Pan done in the engine room. But there's a pub just next to it, and you can bring your pints from there into the engine. It's great. It's a really interesting place. So yeah, so please come along and please spread the word, because I think I haven't sold many tickets. It's in danger of not going ahead, in fact. But thank you so much to everyone who did come to the lie. Yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it. There will be more. So I'll go back to certainly Britain's Protection. I think York, London, maybe Bristol. I'd like to find other places. I know that there are people from Stafford there, and I'd love to go to Stafford, but just wonder how many other people would come. Great. They do that. Well, yeah, there's a bar within a cockstride rather than in the museum itself. But yeah, it's a good place. The bar is good. It's in an old kind of Victoria. It's in the old engineer's house of the sewage works. But they've done it quite well. All right, well, there we are. Yeah, sorry. There hasn't yet there isn't yet been a Sun date put in the diary, but I think it's likely to happen. So the best thing is to keep an eye on the website, join my mailing list. And yeah, anyway, thank you. Well, no, this is I think Lancashire beer that I'm drinking now. But the first, yeah, I only went to the Spa in Whitby. I didn't go into town to kind of go to the proper craft beer places. But anyway, all right, good. Well, thank you so much for joining in for this belated one. And yeah, well, no, Windsor Eton. I have a yearly gig at Eton College, but Windsor, I should look back into it because the theatre there changed hands and stopped replying to me. So anyway, good night. Lovely to see you. And maybe there may be a possible. I'm going to the USA next month, so there may be another outside broadcast from there. We'll see. But anyway, really good to see you.